When most people think of honeymoon trips, they imagine sun, laughter, and the start of a lifetime together. But for Christina Maytina Watson, her honeymoon became one of the most talked about deaths in recent history. A death that sparked two criminal investigations, international legal battles, and decades of debate about whether her drowning was an accident or a calculated murder. This is the story of Tina Watson, a 26-year-old American bride who died on a scuba dive off Australia's Great Barrier Reef, and of her husband, David Gabriel Gabe Watson, whom many came to call the honeymoon killer. What happened that day in the October waters? Who was truly responsible? And why did this case take years to resolve? Here's the full truth behind the death of Tina Watson. Christina May Watson, but everyone called her Tina, was born in West Germany and raised in the United States. She grew up in Helena, Alabama, where she was loved by her family and had dreams of marriage, travel, and the life ahead. She met Gabe Watson while studying at the University of Alabama. Gabe was older, confident, and importantly, a certified rescue diver. Their relationship moved quickly. Within months, they were engaged, and just 11 days before her death, they married. Tina's father and mother were proud of their daughter. They looked forward to her future. They had no idea that the next chapter would end in tragedy. In October 2003, the newlyweds flew to Australia for their honeymoon. They joined a dive boat called the Sport off the coast of Queensland, headed toward the Yongala shipwreck, a popular dive site deep in the Great Barrier Reef. It was there on October 22, 2003, that everything went wrong. Both Tina and Gabe went underwater that morning. But within minutes, Tina lost consciousness and sank approximately 30 meters to the ocean floor. Other divers later reported seeing Gabe hold her underwater briefly before swimming to the surface alone. Tina wasn't brought up immediately. No rescue came. After about 10 minutes, another diver finally managed to recover her body and bring her to the boat. A doctor worked on her for 40 minutes, but she could not be revived. She was dead. At first, local authorities treated Tina's death as a tragic accident. Gabe told police that strong currents and panic had caused Tina to struggle, knock off his regulator and mask, and that he hadn't been able to get back to her in time. He said he tried to surface and get help. But from the beginning, his story didn't add up. Witnesses from the dive were asked about what they saw. One diver later said he saw Gabe holding Tina in a tight grasp before letting go and heading up to the surface. Another photo taken accidentally showed Tina lying face up on the seafloor, something that raised questions about whether anyone tried to help her. And because Gabe was a certified rescue diver, prosecutors later argued he should have known how to help. He claimed he was limited by an ear problem and by his training, but many who knew scuba diving found that excuse weak. In Australia, investigators charged Gabe with murder. The prosecution argued that he had deliberately caused Tina to drown, that he held her down, blocked her air supply, or allowed her to die for reasons we'll get to in a moment. Gabe repeatedly changed his account of what happened underwater, in total giving more than a dozen versions of the events, each slightly different. That inconsistency damaged his credibility. Defense lawyers said Tina panicked, that she may have hit Gabe's mask in the struggle, and that what happened was an accident, exactly the danger novice divers face on deep dives. Eventually, Gabe Watson pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the Australian court. Manslaughter is a lesser charge than murder, but it acknowledged that his actions resulted in Tina's death. He was sentenced to a prison term, but it was a short one, far shorter than what most Australians or Tina's family expected. The big question always was, why would Gabe do it? Prosecutors believed the motive was money. Tina had life insurance policies worth over $200,000. There was also valuable property and possessions tied to her name. Many argued that Gabe stood to benefit financially from her death. Tina's family, especially her father, was convinced that Gabe planned her death from the beginning. They pointed to his years of dive experience, his calm demeanor after she died, and the fact that he didn't immediately surface to get help for her. Gabe's lawyers denied any financial motive. They argued Tina's death was a tragic accident caused by panic and environmental conditions, not premeditation. The truth about the motive remains one of the most debated parts of this story. After Gabe served his sentence in Australia, he was deported back to the United States. When he landed in Alabama, prosecutors there charged him again, this time with murder and kidnapping under American law. Alabama authorities believed they could prove that Gabe intentionally caused Tina's death for financial gain and that U.S. courts could hold him accountable. But when the case went to trial in Alabama, it ran into serious problems. At the U.S. trial, prosecutors presented evidence from both the Australian investigation and newly collected material. They highlighted inconsistencies in Gabe's statements and pointed again to the possible financial motive. Still, the evidence wasn't strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Gabe had intentionally murdered Tina. Without clear forensic proof of deliberate action underwater, the judge found that the murder charge couldn't stand. In February 2012, the murder case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Gabe walked free beyond the Australian manslaughter conviction and returned to life in the States. Tina's parents continued to speak publicly, insisting their daughter was murdered. They fought for years to keep the case alive. They appeared on news shows, wrote letters, and kept the story in the public eye. Many true crime communities nicknamed Gabe the honeymoon killer and debated the case endlessly online. To this day, people are divided. Some believe Gabe is guilty of murder, that he used skill and planning to drown his wife. Others accept that it was a tragic accident, made worse by poor decisions and miscommunication underwater. But one thing is clear, Tina Watson did not die alone, and her death changed many lives forever. So what really happened off the Great Barrier Reef in October 2003? Did Gabe Watson kill his wife for money? Or was it a tragic accident that went wrong in the deep blue water? The courts in Australia convicted him of manslaughter. The courts in the U.S. could not prove murder. The evidence leaves room for doubt, and the debate continues among legal experts, scuba divers, and true crime fans worldwide. If you found this story gripping and want to dive deeper into other unresolved mysteries and controversial cases, make sure to subscribe to Truth Trove Stories. Thanks for watching, and stay curious. In 1979, a woman vanished in California without a trace. No witnesses, no suspects, no clear motive. Her name was Frances Burdett. For more than 40 years, her case sat quietly in police files, unsolved, unanswered, and slowly fading from public memory. Friends aged, investigators retired, evidence gathered dust, but the truth never disappeared. In 2020, one small piece of modern science finally did what decades of questioning could not. It exposed who killed Frances Burdett and why they thought they would never be caught. Frances Burdett was not a headline-seeking person. She lived a quiet life in California, known by friends as dependable, warm, and private. She worked hard, kept close relationships, and trusted the people around her. By the late 1970s, Frances was navigating personal changes common for many adults: work stress, relationships, and plans for the future. Nothing about her life suggested danger. She wasn't involved in crime. She wasn't living recklessly. She wasn't planning to disappear. Which is why, when she suddenly went missing in 1979, those closest to her knew something was terribly wrong. Frances was last seen going about an ordinary day. No goodbye note, no pot bucks, no sign of struggle at home. At first, police considered the usual possibilities: voluntary disappearance, a sudden decision to start over, or an accident. But those theories quickly fell apart. Frances left behind personal belongings. Money was untouched, and she had future plans she was excited about. This wasn't a woman walking away from her life. This was someone who never got the chance to come back. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. One name came up early: someone Frances knew personally. Not a stranger, not a random criminal. But in 1979, circumstantial suspicion wasn't enough. There was no body, no murder weapon, no forensic technology capable of proving what investigators strongly suspected. As months turned into years, leads dried up. The case went cold. Frances Burdett became another name on a long list of unsolved disappearances. Cases whispered about, then slowly forgotten. But her killer made one mistake. They left behind something invisible at the time. By the late 2010s, cold case detectives began reopening old files using modern forensic genealogy. Evidence collected decades earlier, once useless, could now speak. In Frances Burdett's case, preserved biological material was re-examined using new DNA techniques. That DNA was entered into genealogical databases. And suddenly, the silence broke. The genetic trail led investigators back to a man connected to Frances in 1979, a man who had been questioned, suspected, and then released. His name resurfaced after more than 40 years. The man responsible for Frances Burdett's death was someone she trusted. He had access to her. He knew her routines, and he believed time had erased his crime. Investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence. This time, there was nowhere to hide. The motive was chillingly simple and tragically common. Control, rejection, anger. Francis had made a personal decision that threatened his sense of power. He reacted not with acceptance, but with violence. He killed her to silence her. And then he spent decades living freely while her family lived without answers. In 2020, authorities officially closed the case. Frances Burdett had not vanished. She had been murdered. This case wasn't unsolved because police didn't care. It remained unsolved because the technology didn't exist yet. In 1979, DNA profiling was impossible. Databases didn't exist. Genealogical tracking was unimaginable. Her killer relied on that gap in time. What he didn't realize was that science never forgets. For Frances Burdett's loved ones, closure came late, but came. Her name was cleared of mystery. Her story was finally told, and the truth replaced decades of silence. This case reminds us that cold cases are not dead cases. They are waiting for science, waiting for persistence, waiting for the truth to catch up. Frances Burdett lost her life in 1979, but in 2020, she got something back. Her voice. If this story stayed with you, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to Truth Trove Stories. And tell us in the comments, do you believe time protects criminals? Or does it eventually expose them? Because as Frances Burdett's case proves, the truth has a long memory. In 1970, a young woman named Sandra Major was brutally murdered in Ohio. Her killer vanished. The case went cold. For more than 50 years, there were no arrests, no answers, and no justice. Then in 2022, one piece of evidence spoke again. This is the story of Sandra Major, and how time finally caught up with her killer. Sandra Major was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She lived in Ohio during a time when the country was changing fast, but safety for women lagged behind. Friends described Sandra as quiet, polite, and dependable. She worked hard, kept to herself, and trusted people more than she should have. Like many women in 1970, Sandra believed that if she followed the rules, worked honestly, stayed cautious, avoided trouble, nothing terrible would happen. She was wrong. In 1970, Sandra Major went about her normal routine. She was last seen alive in Ohio, near familiar streets she knew well. She never made it home. When Sandra failed to show up, concern slowly turned into panic. Friend called. Family searched. Hours passed, then days. And then came the call no family ever wants to receive. Sandra Major's body was discovered in a remote area in Ohio. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The crime scene told investigators one clear truth. This was not an accident. This was personal, and this was violent. The killer had taken his time. He believed he would never be identified. And for decades, he was right. Ohio law enforcement launched a full investigation. They interviewed witnesses. They questioned men who lived or worked near the area. They collected physical evidence, limited by the technology of the time. In 1970, DNA testing didn't exist. Evidence that today would solve a case in weeks was useless back then. Investigators did what they could, but leads dried up, and slowly, the case went cold. Sandra Major's case became another folder on a shelf. Another victim without justice. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away or died. Memories faded. But one thing remained locked away in evidence storage. Biological material from the crime scene. At the time, no one knew it would one day be the key. Years turned into decades. Sandra's family aged without answers. Her killer lived freely, working, socializing, blending into society. He never confessed, never turned himself in, never faced consequences. The world moved on, but the evidence waited. By the early 2000s, forensic science had changed everything. Cold case units began reopening unsolved murders. Old evidence was retested. DNA databases expanded. Eventually, Sandra Major's case was reviewed again, and this time, investigators had something they didn't have in 1970: genetic truth. Advanced DNA testing was performed on preserved evidence from Sandra Major's murder. The profile was uploaded and compared. Then, a match appeared, not directly to the killer, but to a family line. Investigators used genetic genealogy, building family trees backward, generation by generation. Slowly, one name began to stand out. The investigation led to Joseph Kenneth Fritz. He had lived in Ohio at the time of Sandra Major's murder. He was the right age. He had access, and his DNA matched the crime scene. Joseph Kenneth Fritz had never been a suspect in 1970, but science had no doubts. In 2022, more than 52 years after the murder, Joseph Kenneth Fritz was arrested. At the time of his arrest, he was an elderly man, but age did not erase guilt. He was charged with the rape and murder of Sandra Major. For the first time since 1970, Sandra's name was spoken in a courtroom. When confronted with the evidence, Joseph Kenneth Fritz confessed. He admitted to killing Sandra Major. For decades, he had carried the truth and said nothing. Joseph Kenneth Fritz was convicted. He would spend the rest of his life known for one thing: the murder of Sandra Major. No sentence could return what was taken. But justice, delayed for half a century, had finally arrived. Sandra Major's case proves something important. Time does not protect killers. Technology evolves. Truth waits. Even after 50 years, justice can still knock. Sandra Major was more than a cold case number. She was a daughter, a friend, a life interrupted. Her killer believed time would erase his crime. He was wrong. If this story stayed with you, support Truth Trove Stories by liking and subscribing. And tell us in the comments, do you think every cold case will one day be solved? Because as Sandra Major's case shows, the past never truly stays buried. In 1968, a young woman was found murdered in a quiet New Jersey neighborhood. There were no witnesses, no arrests, and no answers. For more than half a century, Mary Silvani's case sat in silence until modern science finally spoke. This is the story of who killed Mary Silvani, why he did it, and how the truth survived 51 years of darkness. Mary Silvani was 19 years old. She lived in Cresskill, Bergen County, New Jersey, a small suburban town where neighbors knew each other and violent crime was rare. Mary was described as friendly, responsible, and close to her family. She worked locally and was saving money, planning for a future like many young women of her generation. On the evening of November 6, 1968, Mary left her home to run a simple errand. She never came back. That evening, Mary was last seen near her home. When she failed to return, her family became concerned almost immediately. Hours passed. Then the night passed. The next day, November 7th, 1968, police made a discovery that would haunt the town for decades. Mary Silvani's body was found in a wooded area near Jefferson Avenue, not far from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. There were no signs of robbery. Her clothing suggested a violent struggle. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of violence. Bergen County investigators launched a full homicide investigation. They interviewed neighbors. They questioned people Mary knew. They looked at local men with criminal histories. But this was 1968. There was no DNA testing, no national criminal databases, no surveillance cameras. Physical evidence was collected, but technology could not unlock it. The case slowly went cold. Years passed, then decades. Mary's family lived with unanswered questions, knowing her killer was never held accountable. Whoever murdered Mary Silvani blended back into society. He was not a stranger passing through town. He was someone who knew the area, someone comfortable enough to attack and leave without being seen. That man was Gerald Rowland. But in 1968, police did not know that name. Rowland lived in New Jersey, had a history of violent sexual behavior, and would later be connected to other crimes. Yet for years, nothing tied him directly to Mary. As the years went on, Mary's case remained unsolved, but it was never forgotten. In the 2000s, cold case units began re-examining unsolved murders. Bergen County prosecutors reopened Mary Silvani's case and took a closer look at preserved evidence from the crime scene. What investigators had in 1968 was limited. What they had now was DNA science. Investigators extracted DNA from evidence collected decades earlier. Instead of running it through traditional databases, which produced no matches, they used genetic genealogy. This technique compares crime scene DNA with public genealogy records to identify relatives of the suspect. Slowly, a family tree formed. One name kept appearing: Gerald Rowland. Gerald Rowland was not an unknown criminal. He had a documented history of sexual assault, violence against women, aggressive behavior. He lived in New Jersey at the time of Mary Silvani's murder. He was physically capable, and his background fit the crime. Investigators collected DNA from Rowland's relatives to confirm the match. The results were conclusive. In 2019, more than 51 years after Mary Silvani was murdered, authorities officially identified Gerald Rowland as her killer. Rowland had died years earlier. He would never face trial, but the truth was now undeniable. Mary Silvani was not targeted for money. She was not part of a personal dispute. She was chosen because she was alone. Gerald Rowland was a sexual predator. Mary encountered him at the wrong place and the wrong time. His motive was sexual violence, followed by murder to silence her. This was not his only crime, only the one that went unpunished for the longest time. From Mary's family, the announcement brought mixed emotions. There was no arrest, no trial, no sentencing, but there was truth. Her killer was no longer a mystery. Her name was no longer attached to a question mark. Mary Silvani's case proves something important. Time does not erase evidence, and silence does not protect killers forever. Even after half a century, science can still speak for the dead. Mary Silvani was 19 years old. She deserved a full life. Her killer believed time would bury the truth. He was wrong. If this story stayed with you, support Truth Trove Stories by liking and subscribing. And tell us in the comments, do you believe every cold case will one day be solved? Because Mary Silvani's story shows, the past is never truly gone. In 1976, California was loud, fast, and full of promise. But behind closed doors, danger often wore a familiar face. Patricia Otto was young. She was trusted, and she never imagined that the person who would end her life was someone she already knew. For decades, her name sat quietly in police files. No headlines, no justice, until 2020, when one decision cracked the truth wide open. This is the story of Patricia Otto and the man who killed her. Patricia Otto was 25 years old. She lived in Southern California, in a modest neighborhood where people knew each other's routines. She worked steadily, paid her bills, and kept her circle small. Friends described her as careful but kind, not reckless, not naive. She had recently started distancing herself from a man she once trusted, a decision that would cost her everything. That man was Richard Thompson. Richard wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a drifter. He was someone Patricia had allowed into her life. And that was his advantage. Richard Thompson was charming in public. Quiet confidence. The kind of man neighbors nodded at, but didn't really know. Privately, he was controlling. Possessive. He believed relationships were something you owned, not shared. When Patricia tried to pull away, Richard didn't hear rejection. He heard humiliation. And humiliation, to him, demanded punishment. In the summer of 1976, Patricia told friends she was uneasy. She felt watched, followed. No one imagined how serious it already was. On an August evening in 1976, Patricia Otto left her apartment. She told a friend she would be back later. She never returned. Her car was found abandoned the next morning. The doors were unlocked. Her purse was still inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no screams reported. It looked like she had stepped out willingly. Police initially believed she had run away. They were wrong. 3 days later, hikers discovered a body in a remote area outside the city. It was Patricia. She had been strangled. There were no defensive wounds. The medical examiner concluded something chilling. Patricia knew her killer. She hadn't fought because she didn't expect danger. Her death was ruled a homicide, but the trail went cold almost immediately. Richard Thompson was interviewed early. He denied seeing Patricia that night, said they hadn't spoken in weeks. There was no DNA testing advanced enough to help. No cameras, no digital trail. Investigators suspected him, but suspicion isn't proof. The case went quiet. Years turned into decades. Richard married, moved, lived freely. Patricia remained frozen in time, a name waiting for justice. In 2019, a cold case unit reopened Patricia's file. New technology allowed old evidence to speak. Fibers from Patricia's clothing were re-examined. Biological material once considered useless now mattered. And it pointed to one man, Richard Thompson. Detectives brought him in again, 43 years after Patricia died. This time, he didn't look confident. At first, Richard denied everything. But hours into the interrogation, his story began to shift. He admitted he met Patricia that night, said he just wanted to talk. When she rejected him again, he lost control. He wrapped his hands around her neck, held on longer than he meant to. By the time he stopped, she was gone. Richard Thompson confessed. In 2020, Richard Thompson was formally charged with Patricia Otto's murder. He pleaded guilty. At sentencing, Patricia's family finally heard the truth they had waited a lifetime for. No misteri, no doubt, just justice. Decades too late. Richard Thompson will die in prison. Patricia Otto didn't disappear. She was taken, and her killer didn't escape justice forever. He only borrowed time. Cold cases don't fade. They wait. And sometimes, they speak when no one expects them to. This was Patricia Otto's story, and it deserved to be told.